So let's get into the books that I read. Let's start with the books that I read in December. So let's chat about the books, shall we? I'm going to talk about the book that really disappointed me this month first, or maybe I should talk about it last. Hi everyone, welcome back if you're a long-time subscriber, and welcome if you're new to my channel. My name's Jess. I like to chat about books. Today I'm going to talk about the books that I read in December and do what we generally refer to as a wrap-up around these parts. If you're new here, I have two dogs. My young pup, who's 2 years old, is chewing on a bone in the background, so I apologize for that background noise. It's kind of hard at any point to record a video without some kind of distraction from the dog, so if you're new to the channel, that's just something that is going to happen. So before I get into the books that I'm going to wrap up, I just wanted to mention, for those of you who are new and for those of you who maybe haven't watched a video of mine in a little while and you missed it in the last video, I am going to be hosting a read-along of The Invisible Man. I have a couple of friends, viewers, people who want to participate contacted me on Voxer. My plan is still a bit loose. I will put together a schedule. My approach is going to be to start the book in February and read through March. It is quite a long book. It's almost 600 pages, so I'm going to be aiming for about 100 pages a week. I'd love it if you joined us. Just send me a message on Voxer, which is going to be in the description box below, and I will add you to the group chat. I'm going to start out with, well, I read a couple of books that I had taken out from the library, and they've since been returned to the library for other users to enjoy. I'm going to talk about the book that really disappointed me last, and talk about the books that I really enjoyed first. I know that that's kind of backwards. So the first book I'm going to talk about is Fayne by MacDonald. I talked about this one a lot already on my channel. It was in my best books of 2023. It was a late discovery for me, and I really loved Fayne. I think a lot of people around BookTube have discovered Fayne this year, and so I've seen a lot of other booktubers talking about it as well. Our story is about Charlotte Bell, who is growing up on an estate that is not in Scotland and not in England, or it hasn't been claimed by either country. That lays the groundwork for the main theme of the novel, which is this notion of in-betweenness. That comes out in other ways in the novel, specifically in terms of Charlotte herself growing up, so it's a coming-of-age story, and discovering who she is and learning about her past. There's a lot that gets revealed. Initially, when we're introduced to Charlotte, she is a young girl. She's being educated by a tutor, which is unusual for the time. Normally, girls at that time would have governesses, but she asked for a tutor and got a tutor. She's a very curious child. She's very intelligent. She's also very open in a sense. She's very direct. She talks about what she speaks what she thinks, and she speaks what's in her heart. I really fell in love with her character. She's growing up without her mother, knowing that her mother died in childbirth with her, or at least that's what she was told. And then she's also growing up under the shadow of her brother Charles, who died when he was 2 years old. In fact, she thinks she sees Charles's ghost in a couple of different instances. She confesses that she's seen her brother's ghost to her friend Gwendolyn. And she has what's referred to by her father, and what she's always been told is a condition that limits her ability to, or it limits her from being able to go out into the world. And then at a certain point, her father decides that he will permit her to go out into the world, and that they will find a way of managing her condition so that she can potentially go to university. MacDonald does a really wonderful job of setting the atmosphere, setting the tone. She ties in so many different themes, mostly about queerness and identity. It's a coming of age story. She's able to go back and forth between past and present. We learn about Charlotte's mom and her story by letters and then moving back into the past. She does this really well. She also shows us the differences between country and city life when they finally do move out of Fayne. So Fayne is the, I should have said, Fayne is the name of the estate where that is in between Scotland and England. Anyway, I loved this book. I thought it was wonderful. I've heard some people say that it should have been shorter, which I could not disagree with more. I thought it is long, but it's that's very typical for Anne-Marie MacDonald, and I think that she is very skilled at putting us into the world. She's very good at world building, and I didn't want to leave the characters and I didn't want to leave the world that she had created for me as a reader. So I didn't have that feeling that it was too long. I really, really loved it. So another book that I read during December for Remember December was that I went back to a book that I read when I was in grade 8 that I wrote an essay on. You can check out the vlog where I dig out that essay. It was kind of fun. I reread The Daughter of Time by Josephine, which is another historical fiction that specifically re-examines the story of Richard III. And the way that Josephine sets it up is that she has our protagonist, an inspector, Alan Grant. She puts him in the hospital with a back injury. He's bored, so he's convinced to investigate something from his bed while he's recovering. He chooses to, after looking at some portraits, he looks at a portrait of Richard III and he really questions, this doesn't really look like the evil monster that we've come to know particularly through Shakespeare's depiction of Richard III. He decides to investigate this monster and the crimes that he supposedly committed, in particular murdering his 2 nephews so that he could secure the throne. And choosing to do what she does through this investigation and through the retelling of this historical figure's story. And it is interesting, it is gripping. There are parts that were a little bit boring, I will admit. Following all of the different Tudors and all of the different families got a little bit dry, but I think it's interesting because she does use this as a tool to present us with questions about who gets to write history, what are their motives for writing history the way that they do, who gets to tell the stories. I mean, these are not new ideas. It is really cool what he's able to uncover by just uses basic police work to uncover the truth about Richard III. It was really fun to reread that book. It had a big impact on me when I was young, so I really enjoyed revisiting it. Crook Manifesto was the first book that I read in December. I really think that Colson Whitehead is an incredible author, an incredible storyteller. I really enjoyed Crook Manifesto. I thought it was fantastic, despite the fact that I haven't read Harlem Shuffle, which is the first book with the main character in Crook Manifesto, a man named Ray Carney who owns a used furniture store. I did start Harlem Shuffle, but I never finished it. I took it out of the library and I never finished it. I would like to go back and read it now that I've read Crook Manifesto. I think there's a couple of things that you need to know about Crook Manifesto going in so that you'll have a better experience of reading the book. I went in sort of blind, and I do think that it would have been better if I had known these things going in because I would have appreciated the book in a different way. I'm here to give you the heads up. First of all, it's a follow-up to Harlem Shuffle, so that's a good thing to know. You don't have to read Harlem Shuffle before you read Crook Manifesto to appreciate it. It does have the same protagonist, as I mentioned. The other thing to know about Crook Manifesto is that it's not written as a traditional story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's got 3 different narratives at 3 different times that reads more like interconnected stories that don't necessarily come to full conclusions. So we have 1971, 1973, and 1976. 1971 is the story of Ray, who has gone completely straight. So he's our anti-hero, and the story is a lot, at least in Harlem Shuffle, I think, and in Crook Manifesto, it's a lot about how do you live on the straight and narrow in Harlem in the 1970s, and what are the kinds of things that can challenge you to having a straight, or any of us living straight lives. That is, lives where we're earning our income above board and we're not getting involved in crime. Ray has gone straight here in 1971, but then his daughter mother is completely, desperately, like, obsessed with the Jackson 5 and wants tickets to see the concert. And that is the catalyst for Ray's kind of demise, because he has to try to get tickets for this concert. He has to call on some crooked people to do so. That's the 1971 story. The 1973 story is actually takes us to a film set where they're filming partly in Carney's store, where the female lead in the film goes missing. So that's the story from 1973. And then in 1976, we come to see a storyline about some white-collar criminals who are trying to rip off insurance companies by setting buildings on fire. All of Harlem is like on fire, and one of Ray Carney's clients, I believe sons, is caught up, I think killed in one of the fires, and Ray Carney then has to decide how he's going to handle that. The book was excellent. The writing was excellent. Like, despite not having read Harlem Shuffle, as I say, Colson Whitehead is just an incredible at giving you that sense of place and time. There were some parts of the book where I couldn't follow the lingo. I couldn't follow the language and the interactions between the different characters, but it didn't bother me too much because of its authenticity. I just thought it was really, really well done. It was really good at showing the changes that occurred over that period of time in Harlem. I also found that Ray Carney is just a really lovable anti-hero character. I think if you kind of fall for Ray, then you're going to want to read the other books as well, and that's what happened to me. So I really want to read Harlem Shuffle so that I can spend a little bit more time with Ray Carney. Then we have The Break by Katherena Vermette. I've been meaning to get to this for quite some time, and it's really because of the Reindeer Readathon that I pulled this one, because I was filling different prompts. The prompt for this, I can't remember which reindeer it was, but it was to read a book told from different characters' points of view, and this book is told from different characters' points of view. This is a really poignant novel that's focused on intergenerational trauma. Even though it was a really difficult book to read, I think it was a really important book for me to read as a white Canadian person. It's about an event that occurs in the north end of Winnipeg within the Métis community. The story opens with a 911 call to the police, and the police subsequently interviewing the witness. So our witness is Stella, a young Métis woman who's at home with her kids, and she witnesses from her back window, back door, an assault that takes place on a strip of land near her home, just behind her home, called The Break. And then the rest of the story is told from the different perspectives of different people in the Métis community who are related to Stella and who are linked to the victim and who are connected to the perpetrator. Even one of the police is half Métis, so it's really centered in the Métis community. Then the story really unfolds from there about this particular crime. And because it's told from different perspectives, or from different characters' points of view, we get insight into their different experiences and their different, what they bring to their interpretation of what has happened. Initially, it seems like it's a crime story or a crime thriller, but ultimately, it's really a character-driven story about these different Métis characters, mostly women, that really shines a light on the Métis experience, and in particular, the female Métis experience. There's a lot in here about racism, about gender violence, particularly in the Métis community or towards the Métis community, that there's a perpetuation of intergenerational trauma that is told within the telling of the story of this crime and the way that the crime unravels, the consequences, the aftermath of the crime. So it really paints a portrait of life for these women in this Métis community in Winnipeg. And that story is a very difficult one, and I think a very important one that we should probably pay some attention to. I'm really glad that I read this story, and I'm really glad that this story has an opportunity to be told. Katherena Vermette has two other books with I don't know if it's so much a trilogy, but they have the same characters. So there's The Break, The Strangers, and then The Circle, which was published in 2023. And I'm hoping to read the other ones as well. Next up is the Memoirs of Sven. This book was so good to read in the winter because it is set in the Arctic. It is the story of a man who has dreamed about living a sort of a solitary life in the Arctic, living off the land since he was a young boy. In his early 30s, Sven from Stockholm leaves his sister Olga and his niece Helga, who he's been a very good uncle to. He goes to work in a mine in Svalbard. And in this mine in Svalbard, it's set in 1916. It takes us all the way through to 1947. So it takes us through the Second World War. There is an avalanche and he's injured. He survives, but he is disfigured. So the left side of his face is completely disfigured. And that puts him into a depression. He decides to remove himself more from society and goes even farther into the wilderness of the Arctic and is mentored by a trapper named Tapio, who I think he's from Finland. We learn a lot about Finland actually in the telling of this story and its fight for independence from Russia. The historical context of this novel was so interesting to me because it was something that I didn't really know very much about. In terms of Sven's story, he really exits society and begins to live in a cabin in the middle of the Arctic. He almost starves, he has to hunt, he has to build his cabin burns down, he has to rebuild his cabin. I mean, this happens several different times. It's a really interesting portrait of a very atypical type of character in our society, and I thought it was really good. It was very well written. Lots of themes were explored, choosing to live a life that's different from others and why people might make that choice. I had a pretty hard time relating to Sven. It's just not something that I would ever choose to do. It seemed very difficult. It was a very difficult life, and that really made me wonder why anybody would choose it. So, I mean, but from that perspective, it's always interesting to read these stories about people whose lives are very, very different from anything that you would choose yourself. I really loved the descriptions of the harsh life in the north. The story was told with a lot of skill, and the characters that we had in the book were very eccentric and very interesting. The pacing was really good of the story. I do think that the female characters weren't as well developed as the male characters. Helga, his niece, is an important female character in the book, and really the only female character that we get to know, and we don't get to know her all that well. His sister Olga we also get to know, but mostly through letters, so she's not that well developed in terms of being a main character in the story. I liked picking it up. I liked being in his world. I liked being in the world of the Arctic. It's fascinating. Really interesting because through the character of Tapio we learned about the separation of Finland from Russia in 1917. I thought that was a really interesting part of the book, and it takes us all the way through the Second World War. He actually has to leave his little cabin because the land that he's on is invaded by the Nazis. Like that, he ends up having to leave. It's just, that was one thing that I also thought was super interesting about this, just the historical context and this whole idea that the Nazis were able to get and wanted to go and then the Nazis wanted to go as far north as that and have that level of reach. That I thought was really interesting. Then we have the Anthill by Julian Pacheco. I read this also for the Reindeer Readathon. I had to read something that started with the same letter as my sun sign, which was Aries, in case anybody wanted to know. And so A for Anthill. This book was good. It was a little bit trippy. And you'll see that if you watch the vlog. The story is focused on our main protagonist, Lena, Maria Carolina. Lena's return to Mendelin after having left as a child to go to a boarding school in the UK. She returns after 20 years and she seeks out her childhood friend, Matthias, and volunteers at the daycare that he runs for the street kids of Mendelin. She has all kinds of strange experiences trying to reconnect with Matthias, him presenting himself in different ways and never quite being as he seemed. So the present day reality is kind of distorted, or there's something about it that's off. The kids behave strangely. They're scrappy and kind of violent with each other. And then there are also some ghostly supernatural events that are going on at the Anthill, which is the name of the daycare. There are all of these different it's got a very creepy feel to it, and it's also got a little bit of a dream-like, I guess I would say surreal quality to it. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's mystical realism quite, but it's definitely giving you a sense of you're not quite sure what's happening. In terms of the plot, the main idea is that Lena is trying to revisit her childhood and understand what happened before she left, and the story of her relationship with Maddie is revealed through her exploration in different conversations with him and her own recollections of what her childhood was like in Mendelin before she left. The story then takes a turn and moves us into, because Lena's mother was an evangelical Christian and they took Matthias in as an orphan. So the story takes us into this territory of this political commentary or this social commentary about the whole idea of white savior complex and poverty tourism, because a lot of the people who work at the daycare are just there for one summer and they want to, these humanitarian efforts or these humanitarian experiences that these young adults have. It's a really interesting commentary about the way wealthy white religious people take and their charity in poor, not white countries. It leaves you with a really uncomfortable feeling, or it left me with a really uncomfortable feeling, and I think that that's the point. I think it was actually really effective now, having a bit of time to look back on it. The thing about it is that it's told, because the story is told in this way, through the treatment of children and the impacts of that treatment on children. So the kind of divorcing of the care for children by people from their own culture. You end up with these kids in this daycare who are really angry, they're really violent, they don't treat one another well, and they're lives are really miserable. So I've still been thinking about this book since I read it. So I think it was done in a very effective way. And this whole idea that because Lena and her family left, and a lot of the volunteers who come into the daycare leave, and what they leave behind are kids who are completely orphaned, completely lost. And there's some speculation about Maddie and if he's involved in gangs, if some talk about the history of the guerrilla movement. There's a lot that's going on in this book. So I don't know, it wasn't quite what I was expecting, but it's left me with lots to think about. I also read Other People's Clothes by Calla Henkel for the readathon. This one was read a book set somewhere where you've never been. This book is set in Berlin, and boy is it ever set in Berlin. Like, you feel like you're in Berlin, in the art scene, in the party scene. It's one of its greatest strengths, I think, is that Calla Henkel is, I think she herself is an artist and she herself is part of the scene, so she was really able to convey that in the writing of this book. Our main character in Other People's Clothes is a young girl named Zoe, who is an art student in New York. She travels with a girl who she doesn't really know that well, who's also an art student in New York at her school, named Haley, who she doesn't think very highly of. And they become friends though, and they travel to Berlin, and they're roommates ultimately, and they rent an apartment from a sort of a strange woman and her mother. They decide that, well, Haley decides that, you know, she really wants to make her mark. She wants to have these arty parties that are supposed to be a statement of her art, like a performance art in and of themselves. Throughout their setting up of this kind of underground club in their apartment and the parties that they decide to have, they believe or they discover that certain things have been missing in their apartment, in particular Haley's journal, and they think that their landlady, Beatrice, is spying on them because she is a crime writer, and they believe that she is using their relationship as the basis of story for her new novel. And they decide that they need to indulge, that rather than confront her about it like you would, they're going to mess with her, and they're going to set up, Haley decides she wants to set up a narrative. It's a false narrative, narrative about the relationship between Zoe and Haley. Anyway, I think you've gotten the idea. I don't want to tell you everything that happens in the book, clearly. Zoe has a past. Haley is a very insecure, kind of questionable character. What I think that was really interesting about Other People's Clothes is that Calla Henkel was really able to capture that insecurity of young women and the insecurity in young women's friendships and relationships. And also it's very satirical around art school and students in art school and what it means to make art and what is art and whose art is better than other people's art. And like I said, she really captures Berlin and that scene in Berlin. It was very entertaining. There were moments where I did find myself a little bit distracted reading this book. I don't want to say bored. I did get a little distracted at times reading the book. I'm not sure if it's just something in the writing. I thought it was very original. If you want to learn more about my reactions to it, you can follow along in the vlog that I filmed when I read it. Another book that I did start earlier in November and finished in December was Ryot Days. This is a journal-like memoir of Maria Elohina, who is a member of Pussy Riot. I went to see her perform. This tells the story of, well, I guess what I'll do is, for anyone who does not know Pussy Riot, the all-female Russian punk protest group, Pussy Riot made their mark by performing acts of protest against the church and against the patriarchy in Russia and against Putin. The protest for which Masha was arrested is a very famous protest. In 2012, the members of Pussy Riot were arrested after performing a protest song in an Orthodox cathedral. Ultimately, she was sentenced to 2 years in a penal colony. This takes us through the moment where they performed their protest song, to her being held in Moscow in a holding jail, in a cell in a holding jail, through to her trial, through to her transport to this penal colony in a place called Perm in northern Russia. What I will say is that, like, for such a dark story, because it's very dark, the girls thought they were going to get like a 15 days in jail. The penalty that they received was so severe, and it was such a foreboding, kind of miserable story. The conditions in the gulag-like conditions in this penal colony in Perm were so bad, and her experiences were so bad. But for all of that, this book is written with a lot of hope. It's really clear that Maria really believes in protest as a form of political power, and she believes that it can make change. And so from that perspective, it was very, very inspiring to read her writing about these experiences. She continued to be politically active for the entire time that she was incarcerated. She wrote protest letters on the regular about the conditions for the prisoners. And she really tells this story of resistance, and she really emphasizes the importance of resistance and how meaningful it is. I found it amazing. I found it inspiring. I found it sad. And I am just going to read you a couple of different excerpts because I can't not. It's written, the style of the writing is like a journal entries, songs, drawings. It's kind of got that beat poetry kind of feel to it. She includes a lot of drawings of different parts of the prison and the way that they moved around the prison and how they communicated to each other. But I'll just share some of her little pearls of wisdom with you. Here's the first one, under the title, "We Won't Disappear." Revolution is a story. If we fell out of it, disappeared, it would be their story, not ours. Their country, not ours. We never took off our masks. We had never left the church. My t-shirt, to back down an inch is to give up a mile. No sense in wearing these words if you don't live up to them. Here was Putin running for a third term, and many people in despair left the country. But we didn't want to emigrate. In our story, personal choices are political. And then she talks about being in the prison, and she talks about how important it is, the right to say no, even when you're in prison as a prisoner. Because at one point they want to do a physical search of her, and they want her to turn around and show her backside. And she writes, "We have the right to refuse. This is our right, yours and mine." She says, "You can't know all the laws by heart. You don't know what will happen if you refuse, but you have to try." I asked a lot of questions. They don't like questions. They answer, "These are our orders." You learn the particulars of those orders as you go along. You learn it on your own skin. The law can be bent, and the degree of flexibility is something you can only test and practice. Every time you refuse, it causes an uproar. You wouldn't want to undress in front of them, would you? I didn't. Why should I? So we have to say no and see what happens. Like, it's very inspiring the way she writes. And she talks about the name Pussy Riot. Actually, this is a quote from Katya Samutsevich, another member. She writes, "We were inspired by the Riot Girl movement. We called ourselves Pussy Riot because the first word invokes a sexist attitude towards women, soft, passive creatures. And our riot is a response to that attitude. We rose up against gender inequality. We wanted to create the image of an anti-fascist superhero, so we needed to wear masks." I highly recommend this. I got so much out of it, and I found it really inspiring. And I think she is such an inspiration as someone who's been through what she's been through. And she's such an inspiration to, I think, to young women and to people in general, to speak up, to say no, to say what you believe is right, even when the circumstances are very, very difficult. Yeah, it was just a really, I just have so much admiration for her. It was great. I'm really glad I read it. I'm really glad I got to go to her show. It's funny because I had tickets to go and see her before the pandemic, and then the show was canceled, and then 2 years later, yeah, it was great. And then the last book I'm going to talk about is the one that disappointed me the most. I was really excited to read this book, and I have to say that my reading experience of it was not great. I read it for a vlog, so I think, and in the vlog I was a little bit undecided about how I felt about it, but now that I look back on it, I really feel that it was a big disappointment. I Am Homeless If This Is Not My Home by Lorrie Moore, and I'm sorry, I know a lot of people really love this book, but I could not connect with this book at all. I thought I was going to be reading a really interesting story about grief. I thought there were going to be observations or insights or thoughts about racism because one of the characters is from the past. I really found this book to be quite confusing. I don't know what it was trying to say. It's another one of these books that is tying in 3 different storylines. And I have to say that I don't think that she does it very well. The 3 storylines are, well, one is 2 storylines about the main character, Finn. Our first experience with Finn is to spend time with him while he cares for his brother Max, who is dying in hospice. But then he is distracted from that by his dead ex-girlfriend, so the zombie of his ex-girlfriend, a character named Lily, who convinces him to go on a road trip, and he goes on this road trip with her. So those are those 2 stories with Finn. And then the third story that I was referring to is that there are excerpts from a journal of an innkeeper after the Civil War. And I thought that that was the most interesting, but the link of that story to Finn's story and Lily's story was very, very weak. And I just had a really difficult time with this book. The description on the jacket was so compelling. I thought it was going to be really funny, and I thought it was going to be an interesting exploration of death and grieving. And I think that an attempt is made for this book to be both those things, but for me, it just didn't connect at all. I thought the humor was flat. It just wasn't very funny. I just found the humor is bits more perplexing than funny. And I am a person who can appreciate dark humor. Really, like, I'll just, by example, other people's clothes has really dark humor that I really appreciated. So I don't know what, it's a different kind of humor. Humor is one of those things that is not easy to connect with everybody on. So I can appreciate that other people might have found the book very funny or very poignant. But I just thought that the humor was taken a bit too far. I just found the humor to be in poor taste or kind of dumb. I've experienced a lot of loss. Just on a personal note, like I've lost a lot of people in my life. I lost a really, really close friend in my 40s. I've lost other friends along the way. I've lost parents. I've lost people. I do have some experience with grief, and I just had a really hard time getting it. I guess. I just thought it would be so much better, and I was really excited to read it, and I just found it to be kind of a disappointment. That's it. Those are all the books that I read in December. I started Still Life in December, but I'm not finished it yet, so I'm not wrapping it up in this wrap up, but I'm sure I will be finished according to my new 2-month rule. I will be finished. I will be finished it for my wrap up for February. Don't forget to send me a message on Voxer if you want to join the group read for Invisible Man. And I will see everyone in my next video. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Bye for now. What is that film genre called about Black experiences? Blaxploitation film. So it's a Blaxploitation film. That was a new term to me. I didn't even know what a Blaxploitation film was until reading Crook Manifesto. To look, I don't know if it's his wife or his sister or friend. I'm sorry, I don't recall. But it's a little hard to close off what are your final comments on books? I never know what I'm supposed to say at the end.